Dr. Louise Denning is a board-certified behavioural analyst with over 15 years' experience of supporting children and young people with behavioural, developmental and learning difficulties, including autism. Her research interests are the dissemination of evidence-based practice and behaviour analysis, in particular, a competence-based approach to service delivery. Louise is also on the editorial board of the International Journal of Positive Behavioural Support. So I would like to welcome Louise into the conversation. I'm going to step off, and Louise is going to host a panel that is going to contain some of our speakers across the few days. Dr. Virginia Bavell, OBE, Sheila Sakasi, the founder of Advancements in ABA Limited, Dr. Nick Gore, Senior Lecturer in Learning Disability at the University of Kent, Elizabeth Robinson, Head of Post-19 at Beyond Autism, and Dr. Sandy Toogood, a BEM Honorary Professor and College of Human Sciences at Bangor University. So without further ado, hand over to Louise, and I will step away, and I'll see you at the end, everybody. Sorry, Louise, we can't hear you.
Can you now hear me? Yeah. Fantastic. I thought I'd clicked it, but brilliant. Okay, I'm going to start all over again, just to say that I'd like to thank you, Andy, for inviting me to be here again, and the whole team at Beyond Autism. And congratulations on putting on a second successful conference with another set of really thought-provoking couple of days. So you've all been treated to a range of really excellent discussions. And what struck me is the sort of range of topics that have been covered, inviting us to explore different perspectives and depths of understanding all around this central theme around decision-making. And it's a real pleasure also for me to be sharing this virtual platform with a few of the speakers, amongst whom are long-standing colleagues and friends. And I think I need to update my website because it's been the web entry for Warwick University, because I think it's been a little bit longer than 15 years, particularly knowing some of you. I'm not planning to summarize the discussion so far. What I'd like to do is sort of briefly share my own reflections. And then following on from this, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a couple of questions. But I'd like also to make sure that there's enough time for you all to ask your own questions or to comment on what's been discussed. So, whose decision is it anyway? I think we can all, I hope we can all agree, a sort of central tenet, the value that we place on person-centered planning and support, adopting a human rights perspective of the right for every single one of us to choose how and where we live, with whom, how we spend our days. But when you start to dig a bit deeper, as our panelists, and indeed not just the panelists have done, other speakers as well, this becomes a more complex problem. And I was particularly struck by the distinction that Nick made between achieving rights agency, so the right to determine the direction of your own life, and rights effectiveness, a right to high quality support. Whilst we all want to make our own choices, we also rely on others to provide expertise to guide us with our own decision making so that we make informed choices. And this chimes really with the issues that Virginia discussed around advocacy and who judges and in what context and at what stage of someone's life. Some of the ethical issues that Sandy raised when using Seed House's grid, which is excellent. I've seen Sandy talk about this before, and it was probably one of the most thought-provoking sessions that I've ever had in terms of getting an ethics CEU. But also, how too do we balance autonomy with the things that we may have no choice over? Our decisions have to be made within the context of the world we live in, and that world is often not fit for purpose, as so powerfully illustrated by Sheila's description and analysis of institutional racism. The question was asked, to what extent are professionals and experts victims of a normalizing and pathologizing agenda? I think that we must acknowledge that this is a significant problem. And to what extent do we all respond to questions around our own choices with what we think is expected of us? Sometimes decisions cannot just be our own choice. Where does compromise come from? But I'm losing sight of the individual. Sandy reminds us that choosing is a set of skills. We're not born with them, and so too is communicating. The Labour Party Autism Neurodiversity Manifesto talks about nothing about us without us. In order to achieve this, we also need to be able to communicate our likes, dislikes, our wishes, and so on. So we, as in talking about the audience here, as sort of practitioners, teachers, parents, carers, professionals, just individual citizens, try to navigate a medical and social care legal framework and good practice guidance, institutional biases, cultural expectations, changing attitudes, and against this backdrop, try to teach skills and create opportunities that optimize everyone's chances of being involved in the decisions that affect them. Fortunately, we've not all been left with an overwhelming sense of, well, where do I start? How do I go about this? Elizabeth shared some of the creative ways that Beyond Autism is working with pupils to learn about their aspirations and views. And this included the use of talking mats, which Nick also gave an example of. Sandy outlined the value of active support with its focus on active engagement. And really those sort of bigger systems issues, many of us are behavior analysts. Sheila gave us a really excellent example of how we can use our understanding of behavior, and the example that she used was respondent operant conditioning, to work out how bias develops and becomes reinforced. And we can use this understanding as a basis for change. So I'm thinking in particular of the illustration that she gave of the power of language. And perhaps changing our own language is one way to start breaking down some of the complexities that panelists have discussed. As some of you may know, I do quite a bit of work with this Challenging Behaviour Foundation, and the Challenging Behaviour National Strategy Group meetings are very action-focused. So I'd like to take a leaf out of their book and start off with my sort of first question to our panelists. I did send panelists a sort of an idea of what I was going to, so I hope I'm not sort of going to be putting them on the spot. But I'd like to start with, what take-home point from your own presentation would you like others to go away with today? But more specifically, what actions would you like others to take? And I'm going to start off with asking this question to Nick.
Thank you, Louise, for directing your question in this direction, but also for a really fantastic and very sort of inspiring synopsis and set of reflections on the day. I hope we can get a chance to have a transcript of that. So it's a really useful kind of dialogue. So I don't know. This is very tricky, really, isn't it? I guess it's quite easy, isn't it, with this stuff, to get very esoteric very quickly and get quite overwhelmed with huge questions about life purpose and all of these sorts of things. And so I guess maybe just as some balance to that, and it is important to look at the big philosophical questions, but I guess some motivation to just give things a try, really, and just get going generally in this sort of direction more and more, and kind of incrementally. I think we can, as a field, as individuals, solve some of the problems or the challenges of doing this kind of work a piece at a time. We don't have to have it all mapped out, all figured out before we kind of start, do we? And so my experience of doing the Talking Mats work there, and it was a really great opportunity for me, because often, as a researcher, you end up working with lots of other people to do other things, and just as it happened with those studies, I got to do that work directly. And it was a really good reminder that actually the process of doing that stuff is really, really key. You know, the learning you gain from being with individuals, by being with young people in this instance, and their families, and the sort of discoveries that come along throughout that work. So I think it's this thing, isn't it, about this two-way process between practice and research, evidence-based practice, and kind of bringing those two things together more and more.
Thank you, Nick. And actually, one of the things I didn't say was I started off and sort of changed my thoughts. But one of the things about working with people with learning disabilities and their families is you learn something every day. And I think that's something that you've just said there was really key. You said the learning that you get from working with them, and building that learning into your day-to-day practice, I think is really, really important. And I think, and too, what you said about don't be afraid to get started, because it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Elizabeth, what would you like people to be doing, and what's your take-home point?
I guess I agree with Nick, because I think if you look at all the things that we want to achieve and we want our students to achieve, it can feel quite overwhelming. So it is about kind of starting with small steps. And, you know, with us in Post-19, I think there's still quite a bit of work for us to be doing on really kind of cementing that learner voice into everything that we do. We do it well, but yeah, there's always room to improve. So I guess, yeah, from our perspective, again, like with Bobby just having that talk about independence framework, I think that is something that we're kind of moving towards now as a next step for Post-19. But I think, yeah, for everybody else is just to kind of start off small, you know, making sure that you give opportunities throughout the day for the learner to have a voice and to share their preferences and their likes and dislikes. And then once you kind of start getting that information in, then you can start collating that, making it bigger pieces of work. And I think, as you know, Nick has also said, Talking Maths is really practical and it can meet the range of students' needs and support them in all of their communication. It doesn't matter which level they're at.
Did you have any particular challenges in using Talking Maths?
I think it's the time frame, it's the capacity of resource making and collecting all of the evidence. But again, fortunately, with us at Beyond Autism, as we've got a lot of one-to-one support for the students, we're able to put that in practice. But I think it's more for you know, general SEN kind of schools and colleges that might be a bit more problematic, because they don't have the level of workforce that we've got to support that.
Yeah. Okay. Sheila, you brought a very different perspective to the discussion. Be interested to hear what you would like to see people taking away and doing.
I guess really being that we kind of, you know, advocate a lot in our profession for the learners that we work with, having that awareness really of additional issues or variables that will come into play. And not only in the sense of the quality of service that we can provide, but also the challenges that our learners may face, and other areas in which we may have to advocate for the children or young adults we're working with. So I guess really it starts with us as service providers in order to educate ourselves, because until we're fully aware of you know, things that may pose as hurdles in terms of the services we can provide, or may pose as hurdles for access to services for our learners, we won't really be able to better provide a quality service for them. So yeah, I think it starts with us educating ourselves and raising our own awareness so that we're well informed in order to do so.
Well, that chimes very nicely with what Nick was saying as well, and what Elizabeth was saying about sort of learning from the people that we're working with. I think probably that's quite a useful point to ask you, Virginia.
Right. Well, as far as I know, on this panel, I'm the only parent of a autistic and learning disabled adult now, former child, and I remember those early years very, very clearly. I mean, I'm more of a distant because I'm not involved in the field as skilled practitioners and thinkers and academics like the rest of the panel. What I take away is two things. One is gratitude at how much good work, great thinking, person-centered work planning, dedication is going on out there. I mean, this conference has been hugely inspiring for me and makes me realize in the 25 years since I was involved in sitting around a table to set up Treehouse, wow, you've all done brilliantly, and it's really, really exciting. Now, for some of you, and I think Sandy, this will definitely apply to you, you have worked in the field long before I had ever heard of the term behavior analysis. And what strikes me is the importance of history, that I get the feeling that a lot of the discord out there, the hostility towards ABA, comes from it having been hijacked really by a certain delivery mode linked specifically to young autistic children and the intensive behavioural models that are right in some contexts, but of course the field is much broader and the client groups are much broader. And for me, the take-home action that I feel for myself and for everyone else is how still working at how we can actually have a sort of peace treaty with our critics and the people who think they know what ABA is because they had a terrible time as victims of bad practice, and helping to be humble about hearing them and learning from them, not just saying, you got it wrong, we know what ABA is and it's really, really brilliant. And I wonder also if therefore, rather than trying to punish our naysayers, it's something about being humble and congratulating them for highlighting some of the abuses that have happened in the name of behavior analysis, and almost thanking them for drawing attention to the things that we have to deal with. They would be amazed to know that a primarily behavioral conference had dealt with stakeholder engagement in research, had dealt with ethics at its core and autonomy at its core, all the things we've been talking about. I'd love to, the naysayers, to have been part of this and then say to them, what's not to like about all of this? It's exactly what you, the neurodiversity, would be telling us we need to be focusing on. And there's this mismatch. Sorry, I'm going on too long, but it's just how we can all somehow engage in a peace treaty, in a dialogue that actually builds bridges rather than just reinforces the battle lines.
Now, you're not going on too long at all, Virginia. I could sit here, we could talk about this for a very, very long time, I think. I think we need to. And actually, you're absolutely right. You know, it's not just congratulating them for highlighting the sort of the some of the issues that they have faced, but it's also just raising our general awareness around. I mean, we have talked about behavior analysis having a values base. I've been talking about it ever since I first started practicing, but that understanding of what that really means to the individual is something that has evolved over the years, and it's partly too because of the voices that we are increasingly and welcoming from the neurodiverse community. So Sandy, I think that Virginia sort of put a nice introduction for you as well in terms of what would you like everybody here today to be sort of taking home from this, and what action taking? And then maybe we can, as a panel, go back to that question that Virginia posed about how do we have some sort of peace treaty?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Thank you, Virginia. I think you make these points beautifully and articulate them in a very clear way. And for me, I think there are two things that come partly from what partly from your contribution, but also in terms of my contribution to the talk this morning. So what I open by saying we're a very busy field that all of us are working flat out most of the time, and we don't probably create enough space for reflection and contemplative thought. And I feel that we need to do that. And allied with that point is a point I think that you just made so well. As a field, we need to be more outward facing and to have a dialogue. There are 7 billion people on the planet. Not very many are behavior analysts, and not many speak our language. So it's sensible for us to talk about ideas and concepts that we have found to be useful in our field in a way that other people can understand. So there's a kind of a translational aspect to that. In terms of what I'd like people to take away, apart from the suggestion that we create a bit of space for being thoughtful about what we do and why we do what we do and why we do it the way we do it, is to take this idea of the autonomy flip away, so that our first responsibility or our first duty is to enable, is to create opportunity. And we do that through actively engaging with people and building repertoire, and then to respect autonomy once established. And there are lots of ways that we can do that through structured and unstructured teaching, through creating opportunities for people to make practical expressions of their personal autonomies. And I think some aspects of that have to do with making choice meaningful and relevant. And for some people, that's going to be a binary thing. Do you want to do this or that? Do you want to do this first or second? You know, those sorts of things are more meaningful sometimes when there are clear boundaries around options than open-ended, what do you want to do with the rest of your life type of questions. And then the related point, I think, is the value of personal routine, which is so functional for most of us in most aspects of our lives. And is a real gateway to gifting people that very valuable aspect of life, which is to do with expressions of autonomy and control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sandy. There's some there's a sort of clear theme coming out of all of this. This need for, Nick started off by talking about sort of just giving things a try, but also about the learning aspect and all of us learning from others, particularly from the people that we are working with, the people around whom we are conducting research, listening. And those sort of, going back to what Sheila was talking about using the principles of behavior analysis, using that to actually be active listeners, as opposed to, and how we translate what we are listening into changing our own behaviors. Mm-hmm. And also, Sandy, what you were just saying sort of chimes very much with what Elizabeth was saying about in terms of what we can all do is create those opportunities constantly, because through that you build up and then respect autonomy. So I'd like to sort of go back to Virginia's question and just get the panel to I want to hear your views on this, of the how can we, what was it Virginia said, how can we have a sort of peace treaty with our critics? And I think it's not just about, we certainly don't want to be sort of being defensive, it shouldn't be an us and them. It should be just a, how do we engage? And as Sandy said, we do have our own language. How do we speak other people's language? How do we start to behave in a way? And again, it goes back to what Sheila was saying about how language creates those biases and so on. So enough from me. Who wants to kick us off? I'll pick on somebody if you don't talk.
All right, I'll say one thing briefly. In my talk this morning, I did suggest this notion of bags. Now, I'm not promoting bags or proposing it as the way of dealing with this, but I give it as an example. It's a simple framework. It's meant to be easy to remember, and so we can teach a lot of people this construct that has a richness and a depth that people can embroider into it themselves. So we just say, you know, B is for belonging, connection, A is for autonomy and control, G, gifts and talents, S, speaking, listening, sense of self. And the thing is that we take a lot of the complexity in the ethics and the application of our field and distill it into that simple framework, and then say to people, move towards it, not away from it. And so those moment by moment decisions that a lot of people are making on the hoof are suddenly become informed. And what we've been able to do in a small way with that construct is to build a bit of a vocabulary around it, and to have a system of thinking and evaluating and reporting using those pillars as almost as cornerstones. And we've made up things. Some of them might be seem a bit frivolous, but we have a newsletter called Bags of News. And the Bags of News is really a forum for sharing wow moments in people's lives, good news stories, things that people have done that are outstanding and worth sharing. And in a curious kind of way, that device or just that approach is taken on a life of its own, and has kind of built almost what you might think of as a competitive dynamic, but it's a healthy sense of competition, that people want to do good in people's lives and to share things that happen in a very kind of positive way. So we could take that example and we could pick it apart and we could explain it using our behavioral constructs. But actually what we've probably been able to do is to take some rich material that has a strong empirical basis to it, and make it accessible to people that don't have the benefit. I mean, we're so privileged really to have such an education in this field, and most people are not going to get the opportunity to have that. So if we're going to have any value in the wider world with the general population, we have to make it accessible.
And who have you shared that with, Sandy? The bags of the good news.
Well, we're using it with the company that I work for at the moment on a part-time basis. We're using this in the adult social care part of the community. That's supported housing, supported living, and also in the Abbey School, we're using it for sense checking, really. So, you know, we have the kind of curriculum timetable and all those delivery mechanisms that are well established in education, but we also have the BAGS framework for sense checking, all of that. Yeah.
Excellent. Virginia.
I've just noticed two very interesting comments in the chat from Jane, the importance of the voice of people who have very little functional communication, and also Sophie's comment about needing the autistic voice. And so I think we both mean the able, articulate autistic voice and the profoundly learning disabled, maybe autistic communicator who doesn't use words. I just had a moment, if you bear with me, tying all these things up. I just wondered if there would be room for a conference that was specifically about building autonomy and effective communication amongst learning disabled and autistic stakeholders that involved Beyond Autism, TISARD, the National Autistic Task Force, which is autistic people funded by the Shirley Foundation looking to promote autonomy and communication for the most learning disabled autistic people. And maybe CRAE, the Centre for Research in Autism, a collaborative endeavour. I'm a great believer in stories. If everyone contributed their case studies, their stories, that would bring people together and maybe break down some of the misconceptions, and maybe people realise that we've got more in common than we realise.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea.
So if I just come in on
Yes,
the
of
back
course.
of that one, Louise. Yeah, Virginia, I think that sounds a fantastic idea, something I'd gladly get on board with. And I was thinking it's the common ground element, isn't it? And that was really key, I think, when you were speaking earlier as well. That idea that, you know, surely if people could kind of see the sorts of things and the motivations that were behind the discussions that we've had over the last couple of days, that would be, we'd be in the same sort of ballpark. You'd think, wouldn't you? And that's what I'm always struck by as well. That, you know, certainly on a personal level, I got into this field driven by rights and values, really, and technology stuff followed, really, because you need a means, right? And this is and that all kind of makes sense. But I'm, you know, ultimately it's about pragmatism. You know, if there's another way, okay, let's figure that out. That's fine. And I think there's something about that, something about common ground, and there's something about openness as well. That those discussions need to have that openness. Otherwise, they're just a kind of disguised way of trying to convince people of a certain thing, and that's not in the spirit of what this is about. Like, it's kind of this kind of co-production type idea. It needs to be open to some possibilities, and that's quite challenging.
Yes. And that listening element, because as you say, it's not a discussion. It's not a let's put our point of view and the next point of view and the next point of view. It's actually listening and engaging and learning from it. I'd like to give Sheila and Elizabeth a chance to join in on this. Sheila?
So I think, I mean, if you're fortunate enough to be out and about working, showing is really kind of the best way, and making sure that you're always kind of engaging in the best practice. And I'm fortunate enough to work in kind of a lot of schools, and most of the schools I go into, they're like, we don't like ABA, why are you here, you know? And you have to respect that, but it's really satisfying when they see the positive side of ABA, and they see actually how it works in practice, and it's not all these really scary things that they've either looked up on YouTube or read about or heard. And recently I worked in a school where I was working with a teacher who was autistic herself, and she had a really negative personal experience of ABA when she was younger. So I was very scared when I went in, because she was literally like, I don't like this, I don't want you here, I don't agree with it, but the school have said you're going to be here. But, you know, fast forward a few months and she couldn't be happier. The child's making amazing progress, and now she has a different outlook and perspective on ABA. So I think kind of sometimes you don't really need to engage in that. There isn't, again, it's not that us and them. We don't have to advocate for, well, we're amazing and this is what we do. But actually, if you just show people in practice, because you can say whatever you like, unless people see it for themselves, they're not necessarily going to listen. But yeah, seeing it in practice and seeing how beneficial and gentle and not unkind it is, I think that sometimes makes a bigger difference.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would agree with Sheila. I think, you know, instead of getting into an argument or trying to kind of prove your point, as you say, is just listen, but then invite them in. And, you know, we've done that quite a few times with people coming into our services. And even for myself, you know, I'm quite new to the field of ABA. And so it was just really refreshing to come into Beyond Autism, to see how we kind of support our young people, and actually that we're actually able to support quite a large cohort of students who have got significant needs, because actually, potentially without ABA, they would be probably in social care quite early on, not being in education, not having the skills to develop into adulthood. So I think it is about just inviting people in to see how things are done well, and then to change mindsets and perceptions on that.
And going back to Virginia's suggestion about sort of having a sort of a conference around sort of building autonomy, it seems to me certainly, I mean, clearly because Beyond Autism is a behaviour analytic community, there was a sort of not a bias, but there was there was an understanding that we were talking. We are a bunch of we understand behavior analysis, and it was sort of using our field to talk about some of these issues. But equally, you can talk about these issues without talking about behavior analysis, because and this is the bit about the sort of the common ground, I think, Virginia, that you're talking about, that actually we have the same aims, we have the same goals, and we may use our field to address some of these in a way that is not restricted to our field. So working with or perhaps putting on, as Virginia says, something around creating effective communities without being behavior analytic laden. But just showing by dint of our own behaviors that we are happy with it, that we're listening, that we're trying to learn, but we have things to offer. I'll throw that back out again.
I think a multidisciplinary arena is one that is hopefully mutually respectful, and certainly the article that was placed in the chat room about humble behaviorism, it's all about saying we haven't got the monopoly on the ability to help here, but we are a helping profession. I take Jane's point in the chat about science, but I think the case studies or stories in which the science is by illustration woven in are very powerful without us all standing up and saying we are primarily scientists. I think it's about a multidisciplinary helping professional forum in which behavior analysts have a role. And I completely agree with what that Sheila and Elizabeth have said. I mean, a story or a couple of case studies in which progress is described in not necessarily particularly technical ways, but coming from a professional behavior analyst could be really, really powerful.
Yeah. Does anybody want to add anything to that? I'm conscious, Virginia, that you're looking at the chat and I can't see it, and I'm so terrified of touching any buttons on my screen to see if I can find it, because I think I might mess up the system. Andy, is there anything that you're picking up in the chat?
If it's useful, I can feedback on some of the themes that have come through.
Well, I think it would be, because I mean I'd like to sort of leave enough time for our audience to engage with this. Okay, great. Well, so maybe you hadn't seen this any of this actually, Louise. So we went out just after everyone had answered the first question and asked for the thoughts from the audience. And so it kind of tracks the conversation a bit. So there was a reflection that the UK SBA would be very interested in Virginia's points, that there has been a beginnings of a reaching out towards a neurodiversity community. And we've had some people talk about what their key take-home points are. So what would you like, Louise? Would you like reflections on the theme that we're currently talking about, or would you like to hear what's happening generally? I think it would be interesting just to sort of wrap this up, perhaps in terms of reflections on the current theme, because I think there's potentially a very clear action that Virginia has suggested, and I think we can take this forward, and that's great, because I do like things to be action orientated, but then go back to, because I think for me the sort of take-home points and the actions that we can all do individually from this are really important too.
Yeah, no problem. So if I just skim through it a second, some of them actually have been really well picked up by Virginia. So it's been a secret squirrel in the background on that. So thank you for that, Virginia. Sophie was the person that brought up the idea of one thing that's important to note as we talk about engaging in the neurodiversity movement and the autistic community is that, as far as she was aware, there was no autistic voices in this conference. So that kind of triggered the initial debate, I think. It had been reinforced, this idea around the autistic or learning disability group is too much ignored, and that being the kind of perhaps the cohort that falls betwixt and between the gaps. Some reflection on making sure that some of the aspects of what goes to constitute behaviour analysis that isn't lost, and it doesn't become too watered down because of the effectiveness of things. But I think you guys have already discussed how that can be articulated. Somebody kind of came off the back of David's comment when he talks about the conversations and presentations being deeply informed, but the lived experience being in the room is really important. And then somebody reflected, actually, yes, like person-centered planning. Sheila's point was noted on show not tell, which I think has gone down broadly well for everybody, and I think that's reflected in the case studies, a case studies idea, and a further reflection on none of us working in silos, and that we all bring a scope of expertise, lived or learned, but beyond autism or behaviour analysts, I think, in fact, it meant play a part of this network, being proud to challenge while being respectful. And I think the question that was coming off the back of that, as our kind of administrative group in the background, was sort of, what would the panel suggest is the best way to begin building the bridge to enable a conference that's been suggested, which I guess is where you were headed, Louise.
Yep. Can I, before we ask the panel that, can I just make one tiny observation, and it goes back to language, and it's just a sort of a warning that we as a community should not talk about autistic people and people with a learning disability as if they are one and the same. You've got two very different populations there. There does happen to be some comorbidity. So there are autistic people who may have a learning disability, but it's by no means everybody who is autistic. And there is a bit of a tendency, and that's certainly reflected in public health policy, to like the Mental Health Act and the Mental Health Code of Conduct to group very different populations together inappropriately. And that's where some of the confusion lies, particularly Nick, the work that we did around the special edition for the sort of State of the Nation report for positive behavioural support was recognizing this problem. So the question that has been put to the panel about how we might go about some sort of key actions in putting together the conference that Virginia has suggested. Any thoughts?
Those of us who are interested meet again and form a working party.
I think that's it, isn't it? And inviting a range of folk to join that working party, isn't it? People with a variety of expertise and lived experiences, really, and to shape it up together, effectively create that together, a little bit about what that needs to look like an event, or how it could best be structured, what some of the purpose of it might be, and and I think doing that as early as possible is really key, isn't it? So that is the intention right from the start in the way it comes together.
Virginia, do you have a sense of we'd want this to be sort of everybody coming on a sort of equal footing, but do you have a sense of which organisation might be best placed to host something like this?
I'm worried about saying something that's too definitive, because I think we have to sort of reflect on this a bit and come together. I mean, my feeling is that the respected organisations would be Tizard and Cray together. But beyond that, we would need to invite particular representatives and individuals to ensure a sort of breadth, including obviously autistic individuals and family carers. But I would rather those of us who are interested would go away and think about it and agree to meet quite soon, just to see if this rather wild light bulb moment is actually going to explode or illuminate the future landscape.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Agree with that. And I don't know whether it would be yourself, Louise, or Nick or Andy, or who it would be who might sort of convene an initial brainstorm.
Well, we have, and I must say I'm feeling a little bit guilty here, because we have actually tasked the SF Darren, the network, with putting together a group, and I do have a group of people who are interested in taking this forward. So it may be that I can start with that group, and then anybody else, I mean, from this audience, feel free to contact me, and that'll be a really good prompt for me to get this thing going, because of course that came out of your talk last September, Virginia. So it has been sort of bubbling away there in the background, and I think it's clearly time to take this forward. Does anybody in the panel want to add anything to that, or are we ready to sort of move on to talk about some of the other comments in the chat around take-home points? I'm seeing some nods. So, Andy, do you want to share with us some of the comments that are, and it may be that there's some questions from the audience in respect to this?
It's been mostly comments, actually. And funnily enough, I was just going through it again. It has been mostly taken down this line that we've just been discussing and taking to ourselves to an action point. There is definitely something we'd need to balance around not only the double empathy component that was talked about by Damian Milton in years gone by, and how I think actually that's probably what we're all prone to at this point in a slightly different way. But also something very much about how we'd represent those that didn't have their own voice in the same way, and we're relying on deputyship in certain in certain circumstances, or in all circumstances, to make sure that voice wasn't missed. I think I started commenting by being really struck by the point I put when we were asked about what was the take-home point. Was I didn't really know how to pinpoint it initially, but I was driving towards this idea of the one thing in the area that I don't really understand, because I'm not in a position to understand it, is the intersectionality that Sheila was talking about in her presentation on day one, which was so I put the area that I feel the least informed on, and consequently the most driven by, is to register and act and recognising the intersectionality that exists as a social construct. Professionals may not recognise the issue in a professional capacity, which is something that we explored in a question from a practice point of view. However, there is no doubt that there is a lived experience that must be magnified. So there's something we have the Jane commented on not really knowing how to label the type of learner that she's describing, but the person that has the most difficulty interacting with the world, I suppose, or being understood, or making their voice heard, as one area. We also have the neurodiversity debate that exists between those in the neurodiversity community that don't really get on board with any type of ableism and normalization or what have you, for obvious reasons, but there is that kind of barrier and the bridge that needs to be built. But then there's also this aspect, an undeniable component of race, institutional race, bias, and so on, that we need to be thinking about. And if it's exacerbated by disability as well, I think that's a really important point that we need to be considering. Let's see what else has come through. Virginia has responded to actually how to define the really profound autism as definition. In fact, profound autism is the definition, but wasn't universally welcomed.
I should say I didn't welcome it either. I don't think that's the answer to describe it as profound autism.
Yeah, and I think somewhere, somehow, there needs to be that agreement and how we talk about the cohort that we're talking about. I mean, because there is an element of semantics in there that we're never really going to get total agreement on, and if that always becomes the barrier to taking the next step, then they're never going to get anywhere, would be my reflection. But
I think what struck me when listening to Sheila was that, almost what you talked about, Sheila, could also, if you just changed the language, could also refer to this cohort that we're just talking about, because there are institutional biases against people with autism, against autistic people, against people with learning disabilities. And you sort of, so it's layer upon layer, but and actually what we as anybody who is working to support individuals needs to understand every single one of those layers. Now we all have an interest, a common goal of trying to break down those barriers for autistic people, for people with a learning disability, for people who are autistic as well as having a learning disability. And then, as you say, anything else, any other, it might be socioeconomic, it might be racial, it might be cultural. So I suppose we need to find a way of building that into our practice so that we are conscious all of the time of not just the initial obvious barrier that we might be, or the difficulties we might be facing, but also thinking of all of those different layers of complexity without being overwhelmed by it. Any comments in respect of that?
Is that consciousness raising? Is that the overarching agenda here?
Quite potentially. Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of, I'm trying to think of action points that we take away. What do we? Because I think what was really striking about it was just, we have just been talking about the issues that are rightly raised by the neurodiverse community. And it just seems to me that they chime so much with what Sheila had been talking about, but Sheila was talking very specifically about racism. But we can apply the same kind of understanding, the process that you went through with us, Sheila, to understanding from a behavioral perspective, to help us engage with the dialogue that's coming out, that's coming from the neurodiverse community, and to help us also understand how we might change our own behaviors. So, and which in a sense is bringing us right back to what you were talking about, Virginia, which is finding that common ground for us behaving in a way in terms of listening and engaging, which is a behavior. That's enough from me. Any other thoughts? Nick? Yes, Virginia? You're on mute, Virginia.
Sorry. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but hearing Sheila's presentation, which I thought was superb, two things struck me. One was the behavioral concepts that explained how prejudices build up and get reinforced. I think that absolutely applies to how attitudes to people with learning disabilities and autism get built up. So I think there's a congruence there. But also it made me think about the term social validity and how actually we live in a world where there are multiple social validities according to culture, groupings, etc. And it raises a lot of questions about the sorts of behaviours that should be encouraged in different contexts. I have nothing more profound to say about that, except that I know that one of the criticisms of behaviour analysis is that it has been felt not to question enough the possibility that there are multiple ways of being socially valid according to context. The only other thing I note is this question about whether we should look at PBS as distinct from ABA. And I don't know if it's relevant for me to say here that in my local community, one family asked for a behaviour analysis as part of the social care support for their now adult autistic and learning disabled child, and the authority said no way. And then when she went back saying, could I have PBS, they said, oh yeah, it's fine. And she's used exactly the same practitioners using exactly the same skills and tools, and one has had the blessing and one was seen as the devil.
Yeah, that's a big problem. I mean, I think we have an answer to it within our own community, but again, it's the challenge is in being able to open that dialogue more broadly. I mean, I think we're all fairly clear in our minds that PBS is a delivery model and that ABA is a significant component of that model, but it's different. Then it's a category area. We're making inappropriate comparisons, but we need to find a way of saying that publicly with a wider audience, I feel.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree, Sandy. So we've got just under 5 minutes left. Perhaps I can just give everybody the opportunity to sum up with just perhaps one take-home point, or rather, no, let's not do one take-home. Because we've talked about your take-home points. One action, one thing that you are going to do going forward as a result of the last 2 days. Sandy, you happen to be top of my screen.
One thing, well, I think probably what I should say is that I will model the behavior that I've been advocating, and I will engage in some more reflective practice based on the exposure I've had to this dialogue today.
Excellent, thank you. Elizabeth?
Yes, for me, it would be to engage with, because we engage with quite a lot of external stakeholders, for instance, social care or supported living, is about kind of translating our ABA kind of terminology and language into something that they can actually take on to be able to support our learners once they leave us.
Brilliant, thank you. Sheila?
I think for me, definitely looking at within practice, increasing that choice and autonomy for learners in kind of all areas. I think something that I've taken away from kind of watching the presentations is how complex it is for each individual learner, but actually there are so many ways that we can do it. So yeah, I think definitely looking into that more.
Brilliant, thank you. Nick?
Lots and lots to think about, certainly. I think the first thing for me is to find some opportunities. I'd like to connect with Elizabeth and Sheila in Virginia more in the future. Not really met before, and it's been fantastic to spend some time together in this very public context. And it'd be nice to continue some of these discussions as well and find ways of hopefully working together and with others towards some of these aspirations.
And Virginia, last but not least.
Oh dear. I mean, I go away feeling very humble and grateful at how there are so many brilliant people working in the field and doing so much good. I'm past it really in terms of being actively involved in any of this, but if I can offer my help in any way in conversations, in introducing people to people, etc., then I will do all I can to help all of you doing what you're doing so brilliantly.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I don't think that being past it is an accurate description. I think that hearing your voice and your thoughts, your experience, it's invaluable for all of us. So, and I'd just like to. I'm sure that Andy will want to jump in and say something here. But it's been a real pleasure having this discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Louise.
Yes, thank you, Louise, and thank you to the panel for staying to the end and having such valuable contributions. Obviously, we're getting the commensurate great panel discussions, comments coming through. I'd just like to take a moment to sum up before we end the conference, to thank all our speakers. What I think has been a very extremely engaging, really diverse in the different sense sets of talks. I think it's been lots of food for thought, and it's been really heartening to echo Virginia's point, actually, to hear how much broad agreement there is around creating and respecting autonomy for individuals, and it being a cornerstone of education, and that we got to see sort of many challenging areas over the last 2 days, whether it be through sort of professional bias, racism, the importance of stakeholder engagement, mental health, choice through communication, increasing responding autonomy, that spread of early years through adulthood, and the importance of building choice and independence all the way through. So it just sort of remains for me to say thank you to all our attendees, and thank you for everybody who took their time to prepare and deliver such amazing talks. And hopefully we can all move towards the idea of making the right decision when we're thinking about whose decision is it anyway. I'll break the ice. Everyone's free to leave.
Just before, could we just thank you and your colleagues for organising the event and doing all the heavy lifting in the background. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and I'd like to thank the team as well, actually, because I know there's been a few technical hitches that have caused a few grey hairs. So thanks to Lena, David, and Dan, particularly in the background.
Yeah.
All right, thank you guys. We'll see you next year, and thank you very much for all your time, effort, and engagement.